to our Human Capital webinar series. Today, I'm really excited to be presenting to you about why succession planning is so important and what are the elements that make it successful. So today, and I can never get this thing to shift for the first minute, this is Jenine Waters, and in my team today presenting, Marianne Carter. Marianne is a senior manager in our team, and we have liftoff, so that's awesome. And in our people advisory team, and we also have Callie Mitchell here today, who's a manager in our team and looks after our virtual HR space. So we're really excited to bring this to you. We're very conscious of the fact that it is the day before the long weekend. So for those of you who have dialed in, thank you so much for using your valuable, precious time on this last day before the holidays to join us, and I hope you find it valuable. A few housekeeping issues before we get started. During the webinar, you can access the presentation slide in the handouts pane, as you can see in the example on the right. Any submitted questions will be responded to via email after the session concludes. You can also contact us directly. You'll find our details they'll come out to you in an email afterwards, and you'll see them as we go through the presentation. If you're experiencing technical difficulties, please visit the address that you can see on the screen here, support.logmeininc.com, and then / go to webinar. After the webinar, you're going to be sent a follow-up email containing the presentation slides, a link to the recorded session, and access to our past and future webinars and our contact details. So we'll be very happy to speak with you if you have any questions afterwards. So today is all about succession planning, and we're really excited to talk to you about this. I'm going to give you a brief background of the three of us in the room so you can kind of understand where we come from when we talk about succession planning with such passion. I suspect we might get into a little bit of a debate today. Because we all come from a slightly different perspective and different experiences. As I said to you earlier, my name is Jenine Waters. I head up our people advisory here in New South Wales, and my background is 20 years of in-house HR management before I became a consultant about 4 years ago now. In those roles, I've worked in senior HR roles. I've worked in organisations across pharmaceuticals, medical devices, consumer industries, and really one of the key accountabilities from succession from those in-house roles was around talent management, and one of those key elements of that was succession planning. Marianne, do you want to just give a brief background of yourself?
I've worked in Australia, the UK and Middle East. I've looked after HR functions in Australia and overseas. I've worked in different industries as well, retail, medical devices, FMCG, and I totally love this topic, so I can't wait to get into it.
And Callie.
Hi, I'm Callie. I've also worked within HR teams both here in New South Wales and in Victoria. I've worked in HR teams that have been quite large for large organisations, as well as some HR teams that are smaller parts of a growing type of business. And I've also sort of done some community work in our area with regards to HR and talent management and those key development areas. So we're looking forward to talking about succession planning today.
Awesome. Okay. So why succession planning? And this is one of my favourite parts of the discussion, because I think many people really see succession planning as a bit of a tick the box exercise. There's a couple of key reasons why I think succession planning is really important for an organisation, and I'm quite certain Callie and Marianne will jump in if they have more to add. For some organisations in some sectors, there's actually a requirement that you have to do effective succession planning, and it's essentially around risk management for an organisation. So if you look at local government guidelines, if you look at some financial service areas, succession planning is really key in managing an organisation's risk profile.
You know what's interesting? I don't think a lot of people know that you actually need to have that from a governance perspective. I think they think it's fluffy HR stuff.
And nice to do.
And a nice to do, as opposed to actually to look after the business, we need to put proper plans in place.
Precisely. So for those organisations, it's really important. For other organisations, really, I see succession planning is important for any organisation where ultimately your talent or your leaders are critical to the success of your business. That can be a tiny company of 2 or 3 people, or it can be a large multinational organisation. And when people kind of roll their eyes at me when I say if you've got a company of 2 or 3 people, that might be important. But I've talked to people only in the last couple of days where they're saying to me, yeah, my retirement strategy is essentially I'll close the doors on my business and walk away because there's no one that can take it over from me. That to me would be devastating. You spend 20 years putting your heart and soul in an organisation and growing it, and realistically the only way for you to retire or to move on from that is to close the doors and walk away from all of that you have built. So for me, succession planning is really critical no matter what the size of the organisation.
Can I also add, with some of the clients that we work with, they're actually family-run businesses, and they're amazing businesses, and their growth is double-digit. So imagine that, in Australia, double-digit growth. And for decades, the family have run the business, and they've grown it, let's say, to 200, 300 people. In their mind, they might be feeling at the moment that actually the business feels a bit different. I can't quite get my hands around it all. When you do not have succession planning, what we find in many of the cases that we work with is that the employees in that organisation have a bit of fear. They worry that when you're no longer there, or if something was to happen to you, what happens to them? What happens to everything that they've grown to love? And whether family businesses know it or not, having succession planning not only sets up the management team and brings it into another level of, okay, we are looking at talent, but it sets ease and releases energy in the organisation to allow people to focus on what you want them to focus on, not necessarily be drawn to fear of what will happen if some of the family members were not to be there.
So Marianne, it's all about creating that culture for businesses as well, that, that those businesses, those family-owned businesses, those smaller businesses that you said, Jenine, are really, see that talent management is just a key part of their organisation, which actually adds to their culture, makes people want to work there, makes them want to stay for the long term, wants them to put all their energy and their passion into their roles.
Exactly. And even when we look at audit, when we go to audit, look at things from a management team perspective, it settles them down too, because they're not sure of what's going on. And so it actually brings to life a different type of culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because no matter what the size of organisation, I agree with you, Marianne, where the energy goes, where there's uncertainty, is everybody spending all their time guessing at what you're thinking as a leadership team or as a leader of an organisation, and it has a dramatic impact on the performance of an organisation.
Yeah.
So what we're going to spend some time talking about today is what a good succession planning process can look like. Now, one of the first things I want to say is that it's really part of a bigger picture. Succession planning is not the be-all and end-all in isolation. Succession planning forms a part of that bigger talent picture. And realistically, as an organisation that does succession planning, and then, I hear it a lot, we do a great succession planning session, we fill out the deck of PowerPoint slides or spreadsheets, whatever it looks like, we don't look at it again for another year. Okay. What we're going to talk about today is some of the elements that really help bring your succession planning process to life, and make it a living, breathing thing within the organisation. The document itself is, it's helpful. It's actually all of the conversations that come around it that are really critical, I think, to successful succession planning.
So Jenine, it's not just something that you do once a year and you tick the box, it's something that you do throughout the year.
Yeah, it's a living, breathing, I hate the word process, but it is. It's a process, but it's a living, breathing process that's iterative and continues to change.
Yeah, so I can't wait to get into the discussion, because I'm pretty sure the majority of people would think of it as, there's a box, I put a name in it, and I'm done. I've done my succession planning. So I'm really wanting to get into, what does it good look like?
Don't you worry, Marianne. Just as a flagging point here as well, we've got a couple of webinars coming up shortly. The next one is around career pathways, which might help some people as they're thinking about succession planning. And following on from that, we've got Capability Ready, which really helps you think about how do you know when a person's ready for their next organisational move. So we're not going to be able to cover off every aspect of talent management in this session, but bear with us because over the course of the year we'll cover up many elements that are important. So let's talk about the objectives of succession planning and really the nuts and bolts of why we do this. So first of all, it's around aligning on critical roles within your organisation. Now, when you think about different aspects of your organisation in isolation, you might have one picture, but when you as a leadership team really come together and think about what's critical to the success of an organisation, what's critical to managing risk in an organisation, having those discussions and aligning on what those critical roles are is a really important objective of succession planning. The second is around understanding your talent pool and really having that in-depth view around who you have in your organisation and what's important to them and what your depth of talent is and where you're going to be moving with them. It's an opportunity and to have a robust exploration of development actions. And again, the real power around succession planning is that it doesn't happen in isolation, so it's getting some of that thinking across your leadership team, whoever's accountable for succession planning in your business, to have those really robust development discussions and to really think about what's going to help our talent grow to those next roles.
So what I love about that is here we're actually saying you probably need to be giving people feedback if they're on a succession plan. And this is quite contentious at times because it means...
It's a fabulous part. It's one of the most powerful parts of succession planning, I feel, is the feedback that you give to people as a result of those discussions.
And how many times have we seen where people don't want to give feedback because it will alienate someone else? So we're going to get into that a little bit later because this is exactly some of the tension points people find.
Yeah, love it. So aligning on that succession planning feedback is really important as well, because one of the things that's really empowering for people is to know, you know, Callie in our team knows exactly what I think about her and where her career opportunities might lie, and I know what she's aspiring to, hopefully, or we'll continue that conversation after today's session. But what's really empowering is for the people in my team to know it's not just my view of them, that actually I have that conversation at the leadership level in the organisation, and that if I left, which isn't happening anytime soon, but if I did, Callie knows that her career is actually safe in this organisation, and it's not just me as her leader that owns that relationship and discussion.
And there's just something that you said there that I want to draw attention to that we're going to talk a little bit later on. So in that comment you said, and I'm not leaving anytime soon.
Yeah.
So when we're succession planning, the ability of an organisation to really mark, once you're clear on which roles, when these roles are going to become available, actually contribute to the dynamic discussion you need to have with people.
Yeah, precisely. And finally, it helps us think about what organisational actions are required to make sure that this succession plan is real and that we're going to have the right people in place when we need them. And that's not always to say, by the way, that it's about always bringing people in from internally. Sometimes, as part of your succession planning, you're going to specifically think about other ways of bringing talent in, and we'll get to that in some of our other webinars, not today. But for today, it's really around understanding what that leadership is in here. Okay, so some of those succession planning fundamentals that you need to get your head around when you're going into this process. First of all, and this is so at the centre of good succession planning, is know what the employee wants. I really love this one. So Marianne, I can see your smile. Talk to me about what you think.
Oh, I don't even have enough fingers on my hands to count the amount of times we have run succession planning discussions and managers are not really clear on what the person they're talking about actually wants. Yeah. And we end up with a scattergun approach where that person's name is everywhere, which we'll talk about a bit later. But it completely, it is not what succession planning is about. You need to bring the desires of the person and what they're working towards and try to align it with where your business is going.
It's not a succession plan to say you've got the capability to do that role if you don't have the desire.
Yeah.
You know, you can sit there and say, Jenine, you'd be a great audit partner, which we all know I wouldn't be, but you'd be an amazing audit partner, Jenine. You're on the succession plan for the next audit partner role that comes up. Okay, that's great. I have no desire to do it. So if you've got my name in that box, then that's really unhelpful as an organisation, because it lulls you into a false sense of security that you've got successes where you actually don't have them, and it's a disconnecting discussion with that individual as well. If they don't feel like you actually get them, then the chances of them feeling that their career is going in the right direction in your organisation is probably impacted as well.
Yeah. I was just going to say as well, I think you need to have those discussions with those employees regularly.
Yeah.
Employees' desires and careers change.
Yeah.
They might have different experiences. They might have different things happening at home. They might have different career plans changing for many, many different reasons. So it's important to constantly have those discussions with those employees, because just if you've had the conversation 2 years ago, it's probably very different to where you actually see them now.
I love that point. Thank you, Kelly.
So rule 1, when you think about succession planning fundamentals, if you are pulling a meeting together and you're having some of your most senior people come together to talk about people, make sure they are not sitting there putting the person's name willy-nilly.
Yeah.
You make sure that they have had discussions, to Callie's point,
Yeah.
with the individuals before they start representing them.
Perfect. Okay. The other really important thing is that leaders own talent, not the line manager. And that brings us to what I was talking about earlier. It's one thing for me to know who I have in my team, what their capabilities are, and where I think they might go. But at the end of the day, talent sits with the leaders of the organisation, and it's not about any one manager having that discussion and owning that relationship. It's also really important to understand that not all your line managers are going to be really great at talent development. Oops, they want to update my computer. No, thank you. Oops. So really making sure that those relationships with your key talent in the organisations are owned at that much more leadership level, and recognising that some line managers actually may really struggle to identify and embrace the fact that they have people in their team that might be more capable than them, that might have a career trajectory far above their own capability. So that's a really critical fundamental of good succession planning.
I was just going to add, that's what makes a good manager, doesn't it, really? Someone that can actually recognise that that person has the skills and the competencies to actually go far in the organisation, and not actually just holding them on for selfish reasons.
Yeah. What I always love to hear is a leader who says to me, I could keel over tomorrow and my team would be fine, because they are all amazing and they're capable. That I'm not the glue that holds them together. I've developed a team of really capable and powerful people that can work without me.
Yeah, totally. And going back to the very first point you opened the webinar with, Jenine, around your ability and responsibility to make sure you've got appropriate succession planning, that sits with your most executive team.
Absolutely. Not
with the line manager. So it's very clear that if you're going to embed succession planning in your organisation, that you make it that the most senior leaders own the talent moves, not the line manager.
Perfect. The next fundamental around succession planning is the alignment of opportunity and talent. And that's a really key one, because we can have amazing discussions with an individual. You know, I can be telling Marianne that she's the next X, Y, and Z. However, if the person in that role that Marianne's hungry for is never planning on leaving, or isn't going to be leaving in the next 10 years, then it's unlikely that we're going to align the need to move talent and develop them with the opportunity that's there. So you've got to be really pragmatic and real as well around what those likely opportunities are and what the likely talent is that you can move into those roles, and think of alternatives around that as well where the alignment's not there.
And that's a really critical point that you raised, Jenine. And for those of us that are listening now, when you do have a mismatch with talent and when the role becomes available, resist the urge to ignore it and really lean in to start having discussions about what it is this talent could be doing for your organisation. Because at the moment, the talent is only seeing what's in front of them. But if you are to talk with them, you can actually, some of the most brilliant leaders lean into that and open up. And then they end up in places they never thought was possible.
So thinking outside the square and looking at other opportunities for them in that time.
Exactly.
But also being pragmatic about what are those capabilities that you really need? And thinking about what are other moves that you might need to make in your organisation to get leaders into the right positions that they need to be in, might be where the conversation goes sometimes. You know, I've certainly had situations where we see that we have someone in the organisation who we see as having huge potential and can move up and ultimately be your CEO, but we've got blockers all the way along that leadership team where you have, you know, 5 or 6 roles where we know that none of them are ever going to become the next CEO. And you've got to be pragmatic then about some of the talent moves you make to free up some lines to develop people up through.
Yeah, which means you're leaning in and having discussions with multiple people.
Exactly. And then it's all about time investment to develop an individual, and also telling the employee, which is when we get to the fun stuff. So around the development, I think one of the key things I've seen in poor succession planning is where year after year you're saying, yes, this person's ready in 3 to 5 years. Yes, this person's ready in 3 to 5 years. Nothing's happening in between. And when succession planning really starts to get pointy is when you're holding each other accountable as a leadership team, and you're having those really strong discussions around it's not good enough for us to just keep saying that in 3 to 5 years somebody will be ready. If that's not moving, that means we're not developing them. We're not clear about what their needs are and how we're going to support them with different experiences, different learning opportunities to get them to that point.
That's perfect. So when I hear that, from a practical sense, I go, right, if I'm going to be embedding succession planning, or if I've got it and I want to improve it, I have to make it crystal clear to people that investment between the succession planning meetings is a must. So what we expect to see is management investment in the people to help them grow, give them the tasks, give them the projects, give them the things that will help close that gap, because you have a responsibility to them and your organisation to close the gaps and get people ready.
I remember having some really interesting discussions in some of my in-house roles, and one of them was around, we had a requirement from a global perspective that to get to a certain level you needed to have an MBA. That's not necessarily something I would say is a requirement, but in that organisation it was critical. And they had somebody in their business who was someone they ultimately saw as a managing director in the organisation. And we kept coming back to this discussion about, well, but they have such a big job, they don't have time to do their MBA. So every year it was this sticking point of, yeah, they're amazing, but we can't move them now until they get an MBA, and they don't have the time, and they have a family, etc. One of the decisions that they made from the investment perspective is we're going to give you a year off paid, and we're going to pay for you to do your MBA in that year.
Wow, that's great.
You know, and you sit there and go, well, let's stop having the same discussion time and time again and think about if we were to invest in that, and it's a big, significant investment, but I can tell you that person's still in that organisation and they've had an amazing career trajectory. So you look at it and say, what would it take for us to invest in this person, and how do we sometimes need to think differently about how we're going to develop that person. And now, a year off to do your MBA may not be the average sort of discussion point, but it's about having those challenging discussions.
I love that point there, because the ones that actually take succession planning seriously are the ones that look at their behaviours and go, right, what needs to shift?
Exactly.
Nice.
The other thing that I really love about this point is that telling the employee, and this is where it's such a powerful part of succession planning. I remember when I started at J&J, Johnson & Johnson, in my first role as HR manager there, we had a complete, we do this in secret, it's a closed door thing, and that succession plan does not get discussed with anybody.
Now, why would that have been the case?
Yeah, so the thinking that was in existence then was, we don't want to set up people's expectations and then not deliver on it. We don't want people to feel disconnected if they're not on it. So what are we telling people who aren't on the succession plan? Because surely they're going to find out that we haven't had that conversation with them. What if there's 3 or 4 people on a succession plan for the same job and we tell all of them? Will that create a sense of competitiveness? So there were a whole heap of what managers and leaders thought were very valid points. But when we got to the bottom of it, I think it was fundamentally we were nervous about what were the repercussions in telling people what we were saying. The way we shifted that, and it's different for every organisation, but the way we shifted that is we're not going to have specific discussions about you're going to take Janine's job in the next 2 years, but we're going to be very clear with you about how far we see you going, the types of jobs we see you doing, the kinds of gaps we see to get you there, and that was the way we chose to do it. Now, it was also around having really solid discussions with the person who we said, we actually don't see you progressing beyond your current level, and that was really challenging too. Now, for me, I really love the concept of everybody here's an adult, everybody here deserves to hear the truth about what, any conversations I have about them, and therefore I'm going to empower you by telling you this is where I see you, and you can choose to deal with that in whatever way you like. For some people that might be, well, if you don't see me progressing any further, I don't want to be here. Okay, but that's your decision to make. For other people, I had a really powerful discussion once where I had a person and I said, look, we actually don't see you going beyond, a sales manager role. We think you're amazing at what you do. We love that you do it so well, but we're not seeing the leadership that we would need to see you in a sales director role. Came back to me 2 months later and said, I want to know exactly what it is that you're not seeing in me, because I see myself there. And I can tell you, a year and a half later, he ended up being promoted to sales director, because we hadn't seen it at the time, but what we saw in response to that feedback was him saying, okay, well, I'm going to blow you out of the park with what I can actually do, and I'm going to make sure that you're seeing it. So we have really clear and open and honest discussions, and he completely shifted our thinking in that way. Now, if we had never told him that we didn't see him moving above sales manager, he never would have realised that the behaviours that he was displaying to us weren't giving us the confidence in his abilities there. So I see that telling the employee as such a powerful part of good succession planning, and frankly just a responsibility as a leader in an organisation.
And I think it's important to remember, as you're listening to this, just because you put someone there once doesn't mean, and no one there at all, doesn't mean that's not likely to shift.
Yes.
People's behaviours shift, people's wants and life circumstances shift, as we've talked about earlier.
Exactly.
So, but what you need to do is be open and transparent to bring out the best in them and to make this process come to life so it works.
And I think the other thing to really say is when we made that shift in our organisation, we actually invested a lot of time as a leadership group in talking about how we were going to do it, how we were going to message it, the way that we were going to go out to the business, especially because if you've got one leader who's really great at this and another leader who really isn't, you can end up with pockets of an organisation that feel really empowered and other pockets that feel really disenfranchised.
And when you say isn't good, you mean in giving feedback?
In giving feedback.
Yeah.
In giving feedback and in taking that back to their team.
So therein lies another capability that you're building in your management team. The ability to give and really receive feedback is actually quite powerful and a pivotal part to this.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving along, let's start to think about which roles do you plan for and how do you actually really think about essentially a formula for the key roles in your organisation. So one of the first things is identifying those really critical roles in an organisation. And when you think about critical, there's a couple of elements you might think about. You can think about that they have a direct impact on achieving the company or the unit in the company's strategy. So there's something really critical about that role and making sure that we can achieve that strategy. It might be a high value creation role or the potential for that. It might be a role where if it's vacant or it has a poor performer, they could jeopardise a key business deliverable. For me, that could also be around risk. There are some roles that are really critical to the risk environment in your organisation, and you have to have that role filled. You can't have it sitting vacant, or you can't have a poor performer in it. So that might be an element that you think about.
Here's one of the roles like that.
Yeah.
So in an organisation where payroll is not fully streamlined, and if something happens to your payroll manager or you lose them, your ability to pay people correctly becomes something that you will not sleep at night over.
Yeah, and you look at industrial actions that have occurred around those sorts of things. So this is not always about your C-suite roles and your really senior roles. This is those roles if it's vacant tomorrow, things stop. Yeah. And really, really important things stop. So yeah, completely Mary Ann, talking about things like your systems.
Yeah.
So if systems fall over overnight, we don't have some critical roles that are keeping those maintained. You know, in one organisation I work with, the person who maintains the payroll system is critical because it's not maintained by anybody else. So that might be mission critical. The person who pays the people, if it's a convoluted process and there's a lack of clarity and a lack of knowledge management around it, that person may be critical. It could be a financial related role in other organisations, but in others it might be that key relationship owner with key clients. Where all of a sudden, if that role becomes vacant, you're unable to service a client in a really important way. So it's not about just looking at who reports into the managing director and the managing director. It's about what's the impact of that role in the organisation, and more importantly, what's the impact on that role if there's nobody there who can do it.
And what's really important to remember here, I've been in organisations where we did succession planning for nearly every role because we all wanted to feel important. Yes. But we've got to remember, to do succession planning properly, you actually need to invest the time to develop and give feedback and move forward. So you cannot have everyone out there planning for roles. That is not a good use of your people or your time. So using the formula that Jenine has just explained is actually very important to focus your people and focus your efforts, and then bring planning and succession to those roles, because that's what your role is as a manager or a leader in that organisation.
And I think what's also important is as you go through and you know, talk about some of these critical roles in an organisation, sometimes you might sit there and say, actually, succession is not the issue, it's something else. And we're going to take it off the table from a succession planning perspective because we actually think there's an element of we've got the wrong system or we've got the wrong process in play, and that's why that person has become critical as opposed to the role. So sometimes you might actually sort of as you go through and really challenge your thinking on these things, you might get to a point where you understand that it's actually a person's knowledge that's got us into this position, and we're going to take that off the table, but it's coming back to that critical role and what's the impact of that role on your organisation.
Yeah.
So realistically, Miriam, what's the number of roles you think most organisations should be planning for?
Well, it depends on the size of your organisation, really. So I would be looking at your formula and then using that. But if you have large organisations like 200 or 300 people, you would have anywhere between 10 roles, I'd say. But 10, I've got 30, but that's for really large organisations.
Yeah.
But you really need to look at what's the potential of that role, where could it take you, what's the criticality of it, what will collapse if I don't have that role, and you need to agree on that as a leadership team. You need to agree, these are the roles that we're going to plan for. And it makes for a sweet discussion, let me tell you. People really working out, well, what's more important? Does that mean that role's not valued? It really brings out some of the, like when you open up a can, but they're the discussions that people have that are going on in their heads or they're having with each other that you actually need to get on the table, get really clear, and then work towards as a business.
It's an interesting discussion as well, because sometimes I find that the egos come into play a little bit
Absolutely.
too much in this discussion. This is not about my part of the business is more important than your part of the business. Every part of the business will have criticality to some degree. It's around understanding what's the impact of that role if it's vacant for an extended period of time, and what are the sort of solutions we need to put in place. It's not about saying that my part of the business is valued more than another.
No.
It's about when we're sitting around the table as a leadership team, we're not thinking about our own function, we're thinking about the importance of the organisation as a whole.
So think about this, you have a family-owned business, you have the person that has built that business from the ground up at the helm of it, really, quite frankly. If that person decides to retire or move on or whatever.
Or, let's face it, their health declines rapidly overnight and they don't have a choice.
They don't. What do you do there? So from a succession planning perspective, it's great and it wins the hearts and minds of people to have that person there. But if you do not have a successor, the frenzy and the impact on so many lives of everyone and everything that you've built is actually bigger than what you think it is.
It actually, what it does is it focuses everybody inward. So you're no longer, focusing on the customer or anything else. You are all completely focused inward, and we've seen it. We've been in organisations where leadership is, leadership has exited or there's been a gap for a period of time, and all of a sudden you know that the eye is off the ball and we are all focused inward as we kind of deal with that. So this is around reducing that risk.
Yeah, and if you're in a yeah.
So then it's around planning for when that opportunity knocks and really trying to get a bit of an assessment on what is the vacancy risk associated with that critical position. So looking at assess the timing that's associated with the position becoming vacant. For some, it might be a known entity. We know that X person is retiring in 5 years' time. We know we need a successor in place by then. For others, it might be that as a result of other moves where we know we want to move another person overseas, or we've got another decision to make for somebody, that there's a likely chance that that role is going to be vacant in a shorter period of time. So it's really understanding what's the likelihood of that role becoming vacant, then what's the risk. So you might also be thinking about retention risk for an individual, where we know if we don't move somebody quickly or we don't give some people some responsibilities, etc., that they're less likely to stay.
Yeah.
And then you essentially, you assign a value to that vacancy. So whether it's going to be vacant within 12 months, you might be red, or whatever sort of works for you, or high risk. If the role is likely to be vacant within 12 to 24 months, it might be amber or a medium risk. And if it's a role likely to be vacant in more than 24 months, you might have it as a green or a low risk role.
Exactly.
And then again, that's helping you focus your attention on where do we need to have some really, really fraught discussions around if we've got a high risk role in terms of its criticality to the organisation, and a high risk role because there's a risk that it's going to be vacant in less than 12 months, we really need to make sure we're putting some energy into understanding what that solution is. And for the other roles, when you've got a lower risk role in green, for example, yes, it's good to have the discussion and you need to be thinking about things, but it might not be where you're focusing the majority of your attention at that point, because things will move.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So then once you've so where are we now? We've assessed which are our mission critical roles, which are the ones that are really important to the organisation and we really need to make sure we're talking about. We've assessed the likelihood of those roles becoming vacant in a 12 or 5-year and beyond sort of time frame. Then it's around starting to understand what our talent pool options are. So for this, it's really around looking at whether you've got a person who is capable and ready now, whether you've got a person who is available, so whether that's now or later, whether you've got people who are mobile, so you might not have them in your business right here, but you might have people who are mobile and coming into it.
So if you've got businesses, for instance, that is national and you need someone over in Melbourne and you're based in Sydney, if you've got someone in mind, they would be fantastic in Melbourne. If they're not mobile, that's not a discussion you should be having. Yeah. You need to be looking at your talent pool going, well, who is mobile? Who is willing to move to Melbourne to help us get this off the ground? So you really need to understand where people are at. Where this comes really interesting, and I've seen play out really not the best of times, is when, let's say, you have a role where the incumbent is in that role and they're green, so they're not leaving for 5 years or whatever. However, what you've got, and you've done your succession planning, you've got someone who could take that role in the next 12 months. Straight away, looking at this, you need to manage that talent, because if you do not, you are likely to either lose them or they become somewhat disengaged, so you're not getting the most out of them. And so this is where talent management comes into play. So you need to now have discussions with the person about what else could be there. Also, when you're looking at this and you've got an amazing talent who is capable and mobile, but guess what? They're not available right now to do what it is that you're planning for them. A discussion around what is it, when will they be available, is one that you need to have so that you can work out, are there other things in play? But the power here is that when you look at the incumbent and you look at your talent pool, what it generates are discussions. So if you're not having the discussions, all you've generated is a spreadsheet with names You're not actually managing your talent. So you need to get your managers ready, and you need to be ready to be having discussions.
Do you know what I've found? There's some really powerful ways that I've done this and some really visual ways, and I find that generates some really different discussions.
Okay, what are some of those?
Powerful. So we've done it in times where we've literally taken up an entire wall.
Yeah.
And we've had the profiles of the people that we want to talk about, and we've had some of these things around how capable they are, availability, readiness, and those sorts of things. And you come up with, for example, that whole discussion you talked about where we have somebody sitting in a job very happily, they're green, they're performing well, they're not going anywhere. We have another person who's really hungry for that move, they're ready now, there's someone we want to develop, we see them coming up through the ranks, and we know that if we can't move them anytime soon, that we're going to have them disengage and possibly leave, and that will have an ongoing impact. And it's often amazing as you sit back and you look at it out on the wall and you go, oh, actually, what I haven't seen is if I moved that person who's very happy in their role right now, happen to be also highly mobile, and we moved them to the equivalent role in another state, we could actually move our ready now person into that position because they're not mobile, but they're in that same location, and we've actually managed to highly engage them and move them into a role that they're excited about. We've also managed to address a blocker in an organisation that potentially could have impacted our ability to move that person through, and we've motivated that existing person who was in that role that was possibly getting a bit stale and moved them into to give them a new challenge. So sometimes it's really the discussion and then the sitting back and really looking at all of the intricacies and trying to make some different moves that might actually give you that longer term succession.
So I love the fact that you make it visual for them, and it's like a puzzle that you can move, like you can have a photo with those things that we've spoken about, and you can move them around. So visually you can see it comes to life a lot more. And what I would say is I've sat in succession planning where we've moved non-performers to other teams, and it's been horrific. So what I'd say is keep in mind that if you've got people in leadership roles that are not doing that well,
completely agree.
Careful not to move them elsewhere just to create a space because you know you've got talent coming up.
And I think that is an important discussion that often comes up in succession planning is you do end up with blockers there, and you have to actually have a robust discussion about, well, what are we going to do about those people as well?
Yeah.
Because if they're blockers that are just blockers because they're great at what they do and they don't want to go anywhere, that's one thing.
That's right.
But if they're blockers because they're not great at what they do but nobody's dealing with it, then that's
a different
entirely other discussion. And I think that comes back to that that ownership from a leadership perspective to say, what's the impact of that and how do we make that the right moves to match that.
And as part of managing your talent pool, by doing these sorts of visual situations, is you can also recognise opportunities where you need to bring talent from external. So you look at the different areas of business that you want to grow and develop and know that your capabilities aren't actually already there, so you need to bring someone. So it's not always going to be an internal talent management succession planning. You're going to need to look for external opportunities at some times as well.
Yeah, and I completely agree. When we talk about some of the other things during the course of our webinars this year, we're going to look at some of those different ways that you might buy, build, borrow, and bring talent into your organisation, which is fantastic, because I also want us to think about as you go through those maps, and if you can make it visual, great, but even if you can't, there's other things you need to start considering as well. You need to start considering things like, what's the diversity looking like? You know, as you make some of these moves, have we all of a sudden, without even realising it, created a very lacking in diverse, undiverse leadership team, because we've moved some people, but we haven't really understood the implications of those moves.
Jenine, I love that point. I've been in so many succession planning meetings where we don't stop to go, okay, who have we put here? Are we putting more of the same? Are we putting our favourites there? What is going on here? Let's step back. Do we have enough different thinking in here to take us to another level?
Absolutely, because diversity is more than just your male, female, different backgrounds, lots of things. Yeah. It's a whole thinking about doing the role differently and what sorts of different capabilities you can bring into it.
Yeah, it's a really powerful part of the succession planning discussion as well, because often the language people use when they're talking about readiness can actually be a key indicator that we're not thinking from a diverse perspective, because we're looking for the same elements that might already be there rather than challenging some of our thinking. So I don't want to derail this conversation, because diversity is another entire sort of thing that we could really delve into. But it also is really critically important that you think about it in every aspect of your talent management and talent development. I think some other key things to think about when you're doing all of this mapping out as well is to think about that your main plan should really be about moving positive development moves, not that short-term, what do we do if it all goes pear-shaped?
Yes.
So you might have, if you've got a mission critical style role and it's high risk, you might take a bit of time to say, well, what are we going to do if it all goes pear-shaped tomorrow? But the main point of succession planning is really thinking about those positive moves so that ultimately you've developed a plan that is going to be around having the right people ready for the right moves at the right time.
Nice.
Okay. So then I want to start thinking about having some of those discussions with our leaders around how they talk to people around their readiness. So Marianne, talk to us about your experience about
what I'd say is if we focus on, so you recall just a few slides ago, Jenine gave you a framework you could use. So she basically said you could categorize succession planning 3 ways. Ready now, which could be under 12 months. You put the timeframes in, we're just suggesting one. Ready later, which is 12 to 24 months, and then ready future, which is over 24 months. So if that's how you want to build your succession planning, that's fine. What we would say is in that meeting, when you're having these discussions, push and clarify. And there are a bank of questions you could use. I'll just give you one of each, just so you can see that when you place someone in a box, there are certain things you want to make sure the leadership are crystal clear on, so that we're not just walking out the room, putting down names of one person in the room thought, and that aren't real. So for instance, if you've got somebody that's ready now and you've got them there, ready to take a specific role, right? Let's say it's the payroll manager role. You said they're ready now to take payroll manager role. The number one question you need to ask of candidates in this bucket is this their preferred next step? Because what I find is sometimes we have the same person across 3 roles, across 4 roles, across 5 roles. Now, there are times where you would do that, but when you're in a ready now box and you're going to be moved as your next move, you want to make sure it's exactly what that person wants. For instance, here's a question you would use for ready later, right, when we're coaching and we're in the room. If, let's say, you've got ready later, usually in ready later, because it's a couple more years out, if you're lucky, you might have more than one name in there. What you want to crystallize in that is, should there be a lead candidate? So if you've got 2 names in there, is one of them preferred over the other? And if so, why? These are important questions because when you go to give the feedback, that could accelerate both of those candidates to perform differently. So if you know a particular person is preferred because they have done a particular project which is highly linked, if you give the feedback to the other person that we value projects that are highly linked, for all you know that person, or even if you build it, will actually go out and build something quite amazing, and then you've got great candidates. So now if one was to leave or to move somewhere else, you are strengthening your bench strength and you're getting very pointy about the feedback you're giving people.
Yeah. So that relates really well with that discussion I had with that person where I was saying, you can see them as with the
having the right
ultimately to get there.
Yeah.
It was giving them the why of that that gave them the opportunity to shift our thinking. If you're just going to go and say to a person you're ready now, ready later, without some of the why and what you're looking for, it reduces the impact, I think.
Yeah. And so while we're giving you a sense of the types of questions you can ask, there are many, but here's another one for Ready Future. So Ready Future is in 2 years, right? So you know that you are now building a career for this person. So while we're not talking about career planning here, one of the questions you do want to ask is, for this particular employee, how would we map their career to make sure they get there? So that person who's ready future for a particular role might be ready later, so earlier, for one of the other roles. So what you want to do is just take a bit of time in the room and just map that out and check, is that in line with what that person wants? And if it is, you have just developed a career pathway for that person. So they've got milestones and endpoints that they're working towards.
It's really powerful, I think, Marianne, to be mapping out and having those discussions beforehand, because I get a few, like, you know, I know it's nerve-wracking if you haven't done it before, and I think there's some planning that you need to go through as an organisation to make sure you do this well if it's a culture shift.
Absolutely.
Having these discussions, I would not recommend that if you've never done this before, all of a sudden you will go out and start communicating without sort of thinking about how we're going to do it, how are we communicating this, how are we doing it consistently, etc.
Why are we communicating? What do we want to get from it?
Exactly. But I think the power of it is incredible if you can do it well. And one of those key elements that you really need to be thinking about as you start to say, yes, we want to do more of this, is how do you build your manager capability? And how do you make sure that your managers, or what skills do your managers need to have to effectively contribute to succession planning and to help build your organisation's future talent pipeline. So I think that's a really powerful thing to start thinking about when you're looking at your succession planning, when you're looking at how those discussions go, is do your managers listen well? Are they actually bringing insight into these discussions to say, I really know my team and I can really help you validate some of the thinking around these things?
Because they've had the discussion and they've listened to the people, not this is what I think.
That's right, yeah. Sometimes managers, I think they think they know the person, but they don't really know the person themselves. Right. And they talk a lot about having relationships with different people, but they talk about everything and anything except for what's actually important to that employee and their career pipeline.
And it's so easy for you as an individual to put your own lens over what you hear. If you're a highly ambitious person, are you necessarily listening for the ambition in somebody else? You know, if you're a person who's just taking some time to slow down and have your family, is that what you're hearing from other people? So
that's so true.
It's about genuinely taking off your filters and listening and having a conversation. So that's really critical. The other areas are really around how they size people up and listening beyond words almost, and seeing the way they interact in an organisation to see how that potential might translate as they become more senior.
Yeah. So there are many examples. This is why it's important that the manager doesn't own the succession planning and that leadership does. So you can have managers that really rate their person highly, which is fantastic, but what they're rating is their performance. They're not necessarily rating their ability to do that next job or seeing it. And so that's why it's really important. And when you start introducing succession planning, you start building this capability in your line managers. And what I'd say is you don't have to come into the room and know everything. It's okay if you don't. We're giving you the tips of what really makes it really dynamic. And if you get it wrong as a line manager, it's all right as well, because it's about a discussion and these things are fluid. Everyone knows everyone's doing the best they can. And so what I'd say is if you want to give it a go, give it a go. The only way is up, and the only way is to learn. And to learn, you need to be building capability, which means you're going to make mistakes. It's okay. I just thought I felt like saying that, because sometimes I feel like we're saying it's this. It's like, oh, I don't want everyone freaking out.
It's actually a really pertinent point, Marianne, because everything we're talking about now is stuff we've learned over the last 20 years.
That's right.
And it's stuff where we've gone and done succession planning that's dived. And it's stuff where we've pulled out a succession plan and go, oh, all of those conversations were pretty useless, weren't they? Because we've got the same names down, against the same people.
We didn't test ourselves.
Every time we say, oh, make sure you don't do this, it's because we've done that.
Yeah.
We've learned from that mistake.
That's right.
And I think the other really key thing is when you're thinking about succession planning and you're thinking about how you communicate it in the organisation, is recognising that not everybody wants to be the next leader.
That's right.
And that's fine too. And it's not about saying that, you are the anointed one and therefore this is how you're going to fly in an organisation. So I think that's the other really key thing is, and the importance of making sure that that think about this holistically before we start going out and going, well, we're going to tell everybody what you're thinking. Just think through some of these sorts of elements. I'm going to race a little bit now because we've only got a couple of minutes. This is what happens when Marianne, Callie and I get and start talking. There's some really positive impacts that can come out of succession planning done well and done with a high level of communication. At its core, it's really about protecting your business. And at its best, it's about growing it each time with the talent you bring in via your succession planning process. It's about retaining talent. It's about knowing that you are talent and striving to meet a goal and the power that that gives you in an organisation. It's about bringing the best out in your people, and it's about working through what is really possible for your business. For some people, there's a high level of trepidation going into succession planning, and that's because they feel like if I differentiate talent, will I lose people? Does it mean that it's set in stone once I've done this? If I don't then move that person into a role, what's the impact of that? And if you have one name across all of your roles, what does that mean? And what I would say to you about this is that's why thinking about this in advance, thinking about the approach that you want to take to it is really important. But I've generally found that if you're going to lose a person because they're being told that that this is the career that they can or can't have in your organisation, then that's about them actually having the power to make personal decisions.
That's right.
That's actually really important in my mind. So succession planning, if it's about being honest and open and people then making decisions based on what their motivations are, that's actually a good thing. But it is something you need to be prepared for. So I want to wrap up today with a few questions that you might want to ask yourself if you're thinking about either starting succession planning or improving on what you already do in your organisation. One is, how do you define talent in your organisation at the moment? Are you really clear about what individuals in your business are wanting? Are you developing your people for the next move? And do you think about readiness when you're thinking around your succession planning? There are a couple of key questions that you might want to ask yourselves or your leadership team or whomever you work with from a succession planning perspective. Marianne, Callie and I are always excited to talk about any of this stuff. Unfortunately, Callie's beautiful photograph is not on this slide, but it will be in the deck that comes out to you. So contact any of us if you would like to talk further about any of the topics that have come up today. As you can tell, we're all pretty passionate about it, and we like nothing more than to support our clients and colleagues on their path to really building effective succession planning. And then lastly, I'd just like to draw your attention to our next webinars. So on the 30th of May, we'll be talking about career pathways, and that's really around what makes a great framework for building career pathways and what do your employees want to see. So we're really looking forward to bringing that out to you on the 30th of May. Thank you everybody for your time. We've really enjoyed being with you today, and we hope you got some value out of it.